Hello and welcome to Farmland. On today's programme, we will discuss the opportunities available to farmers who want to install solar panels on farm with Chairman of the MREF, Pat Smith. And we'll also discuss animal transport legislation with MEP Billy Kelleher. But first, we're joined in studio by Seamus McMenamin from Bord Bia, the Sector Manager for Sheep Meat and Live Exports. Seamus, tell us about the calf export market to Europe first of all. What's the outlook?
Yeah, the demand for calves has been fairly good. There's been good demand from sort of our key customers would be the Dutch and the Spanish. And there's been, the Dutch trade has got off to a good start and the Spanish trade just tends to start from now on. So up until the end of February, we'd exported about 17,000 calves or just below it. And that compares to about 12,000 calves in the same time last year. So it's been a very good start, and I suppose there's been good demand from customers. There's sort of been a recovery in the beef trade and demand, particularly from food service, and there's lower cattle availability in Europe. So there's good demand for the cattle that are available, and that's then transferred across into good demand for our calves.
In terms of the recent legislation that came from Europe in terms of animal transport welfare, was there a concern among our industry that could impact heavily on our calf export potential if some of the initial proposals were to come into force?
Yeah, no, there were definitely big concerns that it could impact the trade. We had the reviews in Europe and ongoing, and even during those reviews, Ireland was called out as best in class on several occasions, and even our level of implementation of the current law and current legislation as it stands. I think the reason for these reviews is that the legislation just wasn't being applied in other regions, whereas it was being applied here. So we were sort of being penalised for something that like we were complying with the legislation. So no, there were concerns, and I suppose the initial recommendations, I suppose, that came out would have effectively ended the calf trade. Pushing the calf age limit to 35 days, restriction on times and distance of transport. So that thankfully was thanks to the sort of lobbying of some of our live exporters, some of our MEPs in Europe and things. So they done a great job and sort of took the recommendations back to something that was more realistic and more workable, that can allow this trade to continue while at the same time, applying the law as it stands and respecting that, and with obviously animal welfare of the calves being at the front of that.
For those who don't understand, I suppose, the importance of our calf export trade, who maybe feel that we shouldn't be exporting live animals at all, can you explain, I suppose, economically what that trade means to us as a country?
Yeah, well, I suppose if we look at our live animal exports last year, they were valued at about £215 million, and there was about 240,000 cattle exported, and 140,000 of those were calves, and they're exported in the spring. So generally between February and May. Now last year it did extend on a bit longer just with COVID and things, but on into June. But usually the calves are exported at the start of the year. Now the seasonality of our dairy herd calvings, obviously we've got 1.5 million dairy cows, and they tend to calve in a 12-15 week window at the start of the year. So if we did not have the live export trade as sort of an outlet for these animals, it would mean in 2 years' time there would be a surge of beef availability, and we can in fact see it at the minute in terms of the cattle availability statistics. If we roll back to 2020, the calf exports were back maybe 40 or 50,000 from the year before, and if you now look at the cattle statistics, we've got an extra 50,000 cattle in that age group on farm that would or should have been exported. So no, the calf exports account for about 10% of the calves born here to a dairy cow, and they're just an important market outlet for these animals. There's also they're an outlet in particular for the Frisian bulls. There's not that much demand here for Frisian bull calves, and the Dutch market in particular is a very good market for those. And then if we go to Spain, then about 50% of the calves that they take are Frisian bull calves, with the balance being Angus. So it just it is like it's an important market outlet because it takes a lot of these spring-born calves that are born in the same period and removes them from the system as such, so that in 2 years' time we don't see a massive surge in cattle availability, which will then translate back into an impact on the beef price.
Of course. Recently we have heard rumours, I suppose, that people were bringing maybe calves to marts and weren't selling them and were abandoning them, and exporters are finding it difficult to export. I mean, obviously there's a lot of things going on in the world at the moment. Some were to do with supply chain, some were to do with storms even preventing exports. And I suppose in terms of what we can do here in Ireland, do you think farmers are orientating themselves more to a breeding programme that might produce less in the future?
Yeah, well, certainly there's been a shift towards more sex semen and more AI, more sex semen AI to get more Frisian heifers and reduce the number of bull calves, and it is growing in popularity. And then you then have the option then to use a beef sired animal then, or a beef bull to get a beef calf, which is just higher value. So I suppose the more effective that this these sex semen technologies can be, the more higher value animals that can then be used for beef production or export, in fact, because we do export a good proportion of these beef cross calves. You know, so it is about moving in the right direction and not having, you know, that increase in the number of these lower value animals. Now, with regards to markets and access, you know, we are reliant on the export trade to take a proportion of the calves we produce, and you know, unfortunately we are an island and we are at the mercy of the weather at times, and almost every year there's an interruption to the salience at some stage. But I suppose it's just about having the right standards being implemented and the right planning, and you know, whenever you're gathering up a load of calves, to have your voyage and everything planned and customer lined up.
In terms then of the markets that will take our exports, our calf exports and so on, are there any difficulties that we may run into? Again, we're hearing exporters having challenges with countries that won't accept, because we don't have IBR, for example, programme, things like that. Are there challenges ahead?
Yeah, there are certainly challenges. You know, we've seen France and Belgium in recent times bring in, you know, their IBR eradication programs, which means they can't accept calves from IBR countries that don't have an IBR program in place, which we currently don't have. And further down the line, it will become an issue in other markets. The Dutch market, for example, are due to implement a IBR free program. The projected date is 2025. So we're going to have to do something sort of to keep these market options open to us and look about or getting an IBR program in place if we want to continue to export calves to these markets.
Finally, Seamus, just the overall outlook then for exports from Ireland. You were recently on a trade mission in the Gulf region in the United Arab Emirates to develop more relationships over there. What sort of markets are we looking at next?
I suppose we're continuing to focus on the markets that we have close to home. So we have obviously our calves continue to go to Europe. That's their main market outlet. We've then got quite a good trade for live animals going to Northern Ireland. So we sent about 70,000 cattle there last year. And then we're looking at other third country markets, you know, so we're looking at like Libya and Morocco in particular. So we have a trade, we have a visit planned to Morocco in May, hopefully, and then we are hoping to bring the potential buyers back into the country then later this year. So that's one sort of key market where there's good demand, particularly for that dairy origin beef, both Angus and Frisian. So Morocco, Algeria. We've also had some interest from Libya, and we recently had a trade mission from Israel as well, late last year. So hoping to get access there as well.
I suppose the big question on everyone's lips is still beef and China. I know Burbia are working very hard, the embassy, the attaché. Any indication of when we'll get beef back into China?
Yeah, no, as you said, like everyone has that goal to get that access back in again, but at the minute I've heard nothing about, you know, where we are on that process. But we're hoping it's not far away. When you see Brazil going out and then back in again, you know, you'd be hopeful that we would get our access back as soon as possible.
And just the final question I'll ask you, Seamus, is in terms of our produce, our exports, globally and in the markets that we currently export to, is our produce viewed as a premium product or good quality? Does our grass-based system factor into it? Yeah,
no, we tend to be perceived as a premium product, and our grass-fed, green, natural image is certainly a very, very strong part of that. You know, there are some markets where we go in with a lower value product, but generally our products are all going into high-end premium contracts, where our Origin Green and our sustainability credentials, you know, make it stand out from the rest.
Great, Seamus, thank you very much for joining us on Farmland today.
Fianna Fáil, Ireland South MEP Billy Kelleher, you're very welcome to Kerry, where tonight you are the guest speaker at the Kerry IFA AGM. Now, Billy, given your membership of the EU Committee of Inquiry into the Protection of Animals during Transport, can you give us an update as to where things stand in an EU context when it comes to live exports, given its crucial importance to Irish agriculture, especially to our dairy sector?
Yes, well, the committee published this report just before Christmas. It was a very damning report in the sense that it proposed very stringent measures in terms of animal transport, which effectively would have stopped the live export of animals. It would stop the transportation of animals even on the island itself in terms of pregnant animals in the last trimester of pregnancy, for example. Calves would not have been able to be moved from farm to farm. So it would have had a very, very negative impact on the broader agricultural sector. That report I rejected, I voted against it, and I then tabled amendments at the plenary session, which meant that we actually overturned the recommendations of that particular committee. So we're now waiting for the Commission to look at the Parliament's position, which is much more friendly towards the transportation of animals than the actual committee report. And over the next number of years, they will be bringing forward proposals and regulations around the issue of animal transport. There is no doubt there are still significant threats to it, but at least we are now starting from a place where there's an acknowledgement that we must be able to access the European market. And from a dairy point of view, we do need to be able to transport at least 180,000 calves out of the island every year, and if we're not able to do that, it could have a significant impact both on our carbon emissions, our climate obligations, and also on animal welfare itself, in view of the fact we would have an extra 300,000 animals on the island over a 2-year period.
Billy, is there a concern though that there will be changes to the status quo, to what we see at the moment? Can that continue for live exports going from Ireland? Is there so much pressure from an animal welfare point of view? Can live exports be sustained at current levels and current conditions?
Well, I firmly believe that we can enhance animal welfare standards in transportation from Ireland to the European markets. I think that's an obligation that we have to live up to. Ireland is accepted as a country that has very high welfare standards already. We do ensure that animals that are transported from Ireland to Europe have high welfare standards. We want to increase that, so I think stronger veterinary oversight, improvements in the transportation equipment, video surveillance, GPSing, lifetime relay of information of the transportation movements themselves. So there are many areas that we can improve in, but I think fundamentally what we must do in Ireland is to ensure that we increase our welfare standards, that there's strong checks in place, veterinary oversight, supervision, and in the event of there being breaches, that there will be proper sanctions. And of course the real issue here has been the failure of the European Union, but more importantly member states, not to actually implement and enforce the regulations that were already in place. And that was why we had some catastrophic cases of real appalling abuse of animals during transport in some countries in the European Union. We can't allow that to continue. So we must enforce the regulations that are there and then bring forward new proposals that will increase standards, but at the same time allow farmers to transport animals both on the island itself and also to our European markets.
I'm joined in studio now by Pat Smith of Local Power, who is also the chair of the Micro Renewable Energy Federation. Pat, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasures.
So first of all, Pat, let's talk about solar. Obviously, we're in a time in the world at the moment that climate change, climate challenges are really coming up, and every country in the world, every sector in the world has to try and do their part to reduce emissions, particularly in the run-up to 2030 and subsequently in the run-up to 2050. In terms of solar in Ireland, particularly for the agricultural community, there's a public consultation, I believe, about to start in relation to, for example, getting exemptions for solar projects. Do you think that there is more of a willingness now to push the solar end of things and renewable sources such as that?
Yeah, I think that we're well behind the curve in Ireland compared to the rest of Europe, and farmers would know that who travel. If you go to Germany or England, most farms have solar on their roofs, both for generating their own electricity and for exporting to the grid. Notwithstanding that, there is movements that are positive. For the first time, we've a grid connection agreement started in December for this year, which will allow farmers to put up to 50 kilowatts of solar on their roofs and get a grid payment for exporting to the grid. Planning exclusions are coming, have been very slow, and it's been very disappointing that it's taken 3 years of intensive lobbying by MREF to get to a point where we're now at a public consultation for something that's not costing anything. I think the government have questions to answer in the fact that it took so long to get this far. So hopefully we'll have that in the next couple of months. And as far as I'm concerned, there should be no need for planning for putting solar renewable energy on the roof of farm sheds or indeed homes or whatever else. From a farmer's perspective, in talking to farmers, and I would have installed solar on about 50 farms last year, and there's an increasing interest among the farming community to install solar PV, both for their own consumption and for export to the grid. However, economics comes into play, and the supports that have now been put in place are not attractive enough, in my opinion. They need to be improved, and I would be encouraging the government to increase the grants, particularly to the farming community. And I know that the Minister for Agriculture is looking at this, and certainly by the middle of the year we're expecting to see very significant grants in place. And with those grants, I think there'll be massive uptake by the farming community.
And Pat, there's a 60% grant, I think, there for the solar PV at the moment. What would you think it should be? 80%, 85%, or is there just not the political will there to really push the likes of solar? Well,
the grants that are there currently, they're talking about a 60% grant. That's what the Minister has referenced. We'll have to wait and see what, in effect, what the grant will be. But equally important to what the percentage of grant is that the restrictions that are currently in place are removed, and that the farmer and whoever their installer is are allowed to size the system so that they can optimise the economics from a farming perspective. So in TAMS, up until now, there's a 40% grant or a 60% grant for young farmers. But for dairy, livestock and tillage farms, the size of the system is restricted to a maximum of 11 kilowatts, which is not practical in a lot of situations, practical in some situations, but not practical in a lot of situations. That needs to be removed. And the grant needs to be easily accessible. And I also think, very importantly, that the grant should be a separate wallet of money, so that people who have already used their full allocation under TAMS for building milking parlours or whatever, that they should have a special wallet of money that's available that they can go and apply for that grant.
So in essence, there should be a way for farmers to access funds for solar separate to maybe the general public?
Well, certainly in TAMS, and you know, there was a 10 million budget put in place 3 years ago for solar PV. Only 300,000 of that, I understand, has been drawn down because the restrictions were too much, and an awful lot of the farmers who basically would have liked to avail of that part of that 10 million had already used their allocation. So whatever the rules are and whatever the percentage is, what the government need to do more than anything else is make it easily accessible and get rid of some of the restrictions so that farmers can optimise the use of solar PV, both for the consumption of energy on their own farm, but also for the export of energy to the grid.
In terms of installing solar PV, let's take, for example, a dairy farmer, not particularly massive, but not small, maybe 50 to 60 cows, a couple of sheds, a parlour. What would it cost for them to install 2 to 3 solar panels, 4 solar panels?
Yeah, the system size will be dictated by the energy use on the farm. And the other restricting factor is whether the supply is single phase or 3-phase. But a typical dairy farm, single phase with maybe the home linked to the farm, probably putting on 9 kilowatts of solar PV, between 6 and 9 kilowatts is probably the way to go. That will generate probably 30 to 40% of their daytime energy requirements. It won't generate at all. And the cost can be anywhere from, I suppose, 10 to 15,000 before they get any grant that's available. Thankfully, for a renewable investment, the VAT is refundable, which is a big positive for the farming community. And particularly for sole traders, the tax benefit can be very attractive in the fact that you can write 100% of the investment off against your tax in the year of the investment. Solar PV makes good economic sense. Energy prices are increasing, and for every 5 cent that electricity prices increases, the payback drops a year.
So ultimately, what sort of savings could a farmer make?
Well, it's interesting in my assessment of farms over the last few years that for example, on dairy farms, the cost of energy can be anywhere between 1 cent per litre of milk to 3 cents per litre of milk. So there's efficiency issues. But the typical farm should be planning to displace 30 to 40% of their bought-in electricity. And that can be anywhere between £2,000 a year and £10,000 a year, depending on the farm size.
Is it worth the while of smaller farmers to invest in solar?
Everybody, in my humble opinion, every home, farm and business in the country will have solar PV on their roofs in the years to come. It'll be driven by economics in the first sense, by way of whatever supports are available and the fact that energy prices are increasing. It will also be driven by the sustainability piece, and we now see the impact of a geopolitical issue in the Ukraine on diesel prices, on electricity prices and whatnot. And it'll also be driven by policy, because we have to decarbonise. We can talk the talk, but every citizen in the country has a role to play in trying to meet those climate change targets that we've now signed up to.
And farmers who do install solar PV, what is the situation with them exporting back to the grid? And, you know, there has been talk recently as well that farmers may not get the credits for using solar energy, or may not get credit for selling back to the grid.
Yeah, I think there's a conundrum there for the department in that at European level, I think there's an issue that if they give a TAMS grant that somehow a farmer can't then get paid for exporting to the grid. I certainly had some discussions with the Department of Agriculture, and I think I've highlighted the impracticality of what they're proposing and the fact that it's not going to be policeable. So I'm hoping that whatever grants are available that come forward, that the farmer will be able to export to the grid. He may not get a premium payment for exporting to the grid, but he should be allowed to get a market-related payment, which is not subsidised.
And then in terms of the provider of the grants, you're saying there it's obviously the responsibility of the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, probably more so than the Department of Environment?
Well, there are a number of different grants available now, and the SAEI have done a great job in administrating, for example, the domestic grant for solar PV, and I believe they're very well equipped to administer grants to businesses and indeed farms going forward. And there is a new grant being mooted. Again, I don't think it's ambitious enough. It's certainly for small businesses and farms that don't want to go down the TAMS route. I think it should be improved. But the farmer will have a number of options. He will be able to use some of his TAMS wallet to invest in solar PV, or he will be able to maybe get a grant through the SAEI. And now there is also a premium payment available for farmers who want to export to the grid for up to 50 kilowatts.
Are there any challenges in that whole process at the moment in terms of trying to get solar onto the top of a shed in a farm?
Look, solar PV is a well-proven technology, and once you use the right technology, you're investing into something that can last decades. We have a panel, for example, that is warranted for both 30 years product and 30-year performance, manufactured in Germany. So once you use the right technology, I believe that it's a very wise investment. Once the investment is paid for, then unless the sky falls in, you're going to have free energy for decades. And certainly the economics of it makes sense. There's no moving parts. It's all electrical, so the maintenance element of it is very low. And I don't see any reasons. The bureaucracy, I suppose, of grants is the one thing that needs to be simplified. Make it simple and encourage people to go about investing. I think the banks are up for lending what's required. The credit unions are there. And indeed, by way of paybacks, a farmer can look forward to between 3 and 5 year payback on his investment. And that's not bad when you're looking at a technology that can deliver for the next 30, 40 years for him.
And Pat, Pat, in terms of the solar at the moment then, in the world that we currently live in, with inflation rising daily and the cost of energy rising daily, do you feel there should be more of a push and more support coming from the likes of the department or from government in a way of seeking a solution to rising energy costs at the minute?
This is it's a complex one, and the government do have the wherewithal to try and assist. And I think the way energy prices are going, they're going to have to intervene a lot more, and certainly think they're up for it. We're in uncharted waters. It's 70 or 80 years since we had a situation like we now have in Europe, and nobody knows what's going to happen in the next coming months. And all we can do, and all farmers can do, is control the controllables and hope that the government can guide and assist in every way possible to see homes and businesses through this, because it's not going to be easy for everyone.
And finally, Pat, just referring back to what we were discussing there earlier in relation to the exemptions that may come through the planning process for solar projects, do you think that they could be open to perhaps environmental challenges?
I think the process has been extensive, and I'd hope and pray that in the context of a renewable resource that is going to help the sustainability of energy generation in Ireland, that people would look at as a positive move, and that I don't see any objections. I don't think there will be. But we're living in Ireland.
Well, there have been challenges, I suppose, to individual projects, you know, in every local authority area around the country previously. So I suppose, and that was ones that required planning permission. So I was just wondering if there could be any room there that it might be open to challenge. But as you said, it is a renewable resource.
Everything is open to challenge, but our experience to date is, unlike big wind, where there's a lot of objection, we don't see people objecting to solar PV. It's a renewable technology. I think that one thing that everyone in this country has to wake up to is self-sufficiency in energy. It's something that we should have a plan to attain. And in that context, I think the planning rules have to be amended to try and ensure that whether it's solar PV or anaerobic digestion plants or whatever else, that they can get through the planning process quickly and that they can be built out as vital infrastructure.
Because, of course, there is a lot of talk at the moment about anaerobic digestion, biomethane, in terms of fertiliser. Is that something that we should be more orientated towards?
Yeah, well, in local power, I've had a great interest in anaerobic digestion for the last number of years, and we put a team together that provides both the technology and the management, a turnkey solution for big anaerobic digestion plants for biomethane. And with the way fertiliser prices are going, I think there is now a real opportunity for the government to grab this AD industry and get it going. And I think that the farming community are going to be central to it. And if it's done properly, we could create a lot of biomethane, which will reduce our gas imports significantly, and we can create a biofertiliser that can also reduce our fertiliser costs significantly going forward. And the farming community have to be very much central to all of this. For example, Stella, I have a pilot project going on in the UK at the minute, where the digestate, which is at the end of the AD process, where we're dewatering that digestate using a French technology to create a biofertiliser. And with the way prices are going, the economics of this is all becoming possible. And I think it's something that the farming community should be encouraged to get more involved in.
Pat Smith, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure, thank you.
That's all for this episode of Farmland. Thanks for watching. Be sure and stay up to date with all the latest in agricultural news on the Agriland website and the following links.